Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. We're glad you've joined us in this study in the book of Acts, and we have been looking at Paul's journey to Rome. And last we looked in Acts chapter 27, things seemed very dire indeed. You recall that Paul had gone on this journey as a prisoner. He had appealed his case to Caesar, and of course, in order to appear before Caesar, he had to go to Rome. He was in the custody of a centurion named Julius, and they were on a boat, they were on a ship that had been caught up in a very violent storm. And if you recall, last we looked, the situation seemed as though there was no hope. In fact, that's exactly how Luke records it for us. In Luke 27 and in verse 20, Luke tells us that since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. All they could do was let themselves be battered by this storm without any control of the ship, and they were at the complete mercy of the elements. And of course, the darkness of the weather that Luke describes for us is perfectly indicative of the darkness that they must have felt within themselves. The mood and the attitude of this whole scene is a very somber and sobering one. And if we were to stop here, we might get the idea that this is the end for them. But instead, we find that Paul gives them a reminder of some things that he had said before. In Acts 27 and in verse 21, we read, "When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, 'Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who were sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on a certain island.'" There are lots of things that are important here, and a couple that I'd like to point out. First is in this "I told you so" to the people that Paul was traveling with, he expressed his utter commitment to God. He describes him as the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. In verse 23, he speaks of a visit that he had received by an angel of this God to whom he belonged and whom he served. Paul speaks of the way that he had given himself utterly to God. And just a few quick glimpses of the life that Paul led after he became a Christian shows emphatic evidence that Paul had given himself over completely to God, that he was serving him with every fiber of his being, and he was doing everything in his power as a human and in the power of his reliance on God to do all that God wanted him to do. That takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of confidence to do that. And Paul relied on that. Paul relied on the promises that God made to him in that visit from the angel. In verse 24, the angel says, "You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who were sailing with you." Now, Paul said earlier that there would be no loss of life in verse 22, but the ship was going to be destroyed. But their lives would be spared. God spoke something to Paul. And Paul, being the believer in the utter reliability of God's word, knew that whatever he spoke would certainly come to pass. He was completely confident in God. And that's what he says. In verse 25, he says, "Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will be just as he said it would be. Keep up your courage, for I believe God." Now that's confidence. And Paul, in this "I told you so," didn't speak spitefully to these men who should have listened to what he said before. Instead, what he did was he took the opportunity to emphasize God's presence, God's protection, and God's providence, not just to Paul, but also to Paul's traveling companions. Paul was on his way to Rome. And Paul believed that going to Rome was going to serve the purposes of God. And God had made it clear that he would get to Rome. So, in order to believe what God said about his getting to Rome, he had to believe that his life was not going to be cut short and going to be ended in a disastrous journey at sea. I believe God, he said, that it will turn out to be exactly as he told me. Oh, if we could only have that confidence, that utter belief, faith, and trust in the Word of God and what he told us. Well, we go back to our reading in Acts, and we find that they begin to near some land, and it is heartening to them for obvious reasons. In verse 27, it says, "When the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the soldiers began to surmise that they were approaching some land, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little further on they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, 'Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish.' Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it, began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons, and when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. And when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach." We'll stop there for now. Paul gives them the opportunity to be heartened not only emotionally and spiritually, but also physically. But they're also heartened by the fact that they recognize that the sea is getting less deep and that land seems to be coming up. In this map that shows, again, the way in which they might have been driven across the Adriatic Sea, we don't really have any idea as to what their exact voyage might have been as far as the way that the ship might have traveled. This map just gives us an idea of the way that they were tossed about, going in every direction, all over the place. But they do surmise that something's happening, and so they take soundings. 1 fathom is about 6 feet, so therefore 20 fathoms would be 120 feet. 15 fathoms would be 90 feet. The idea is that they're getting closer and closer and closer to land, and they're afraid that even though Paul had said earlier that they're going to lose the ship, that's really not what they want. And so they throw out the anchors, hoping to slow them down, because knowing that land is certainly coming up, they didn't want to get caught up in any of the rocks and destroy the ship. So they took whatever course they could to keep that from happening. But Paul realizes that these men have gone so long without food, and he offers them some encouragement. He reminds them of the fact that they need to eat something. They need to keep up their strength, because even once they do lose the ship, remember Paul had promised that they would, they were going to need to keep up their strength just for mere survival. And so Paul says, "I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." You won't die in a shipwreck. Paul promises. But you do need to eat. And they had food on board, and they hadn't eaten for some time, and they needed to eat. And I understand probably why they didn't. I mean, being tossed back and forth on a boat that's listing from side to side might take your appetite away really quickly. And certainly, maybe that's how some of these men, some of them even experienced sailors, might have felt. Remember before the darkness of the mood was just so thick you could probably cut it with a knife. In fact, in verse 29, it tells us that fearing that they might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast those 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But Paul says, look, you've got to eat something. And so he encourages them to eat, but he also sets himself as an example. It says, having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. Paul says, I encourage you to take some food. And they were encouraged, and they took some food. They saw perhaps the confidence that Paul had in his God, the confidence that he believed in God, the confidence that they would certainly live to see other days. And so Paul says, we've got to eat. We've got to take our strength in order to make sure that occurs. Now, this brings us back to something that we've looked at before. The idea that although God makes promises, God, through his grace, provides for men. We might call that God's providence. Still, he expects man to do their part. In every gift that God gives to us, there is something in that gift that partners with man. Certainly in the gift of salvation. God promises salvation to us, and the Bible tells us that salvation is a gift. But he also expects that we're going to do our part in accepting that gift. We will do it on the premise that we believe him, and that if we do what he says, he will gift us with the promise that he's made. Well, this is certainly true in what's going on here. Not that Paul is promising them spiritual salvation, but he is promising them deliverance from the physical drama that they're having to endure. And they were encouraged, not just by Paul's words, but by Paul's example. And this tells us something, that Paul's estimation before these men is rising and rising and rising. We'd seen before where Paul had given the advice, but the centurion, Julius, was more inclined to listen to the ship's pilot and the commander of the boat, and disregarded what Paul had said. Well, I wonder what the commander and the pilot and the centurion are thinking now concerning those things that Paul had said. I want you to notice something also. It says in verse 36 that all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. And then Luke gives us a little detail here. All of us in the ship, in verse 37, were 276 persons. So 276 persons. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people whom God had granted safety to. In spite of how dark things must have seemed, Paul said, I believe God. I'm going to do what we can to partner with God so that we can be saved. Well, they continued to recognize that there was some land coming up, although they didn't know what the land was or what country or what place it might have belonged to. But verse 39 says, they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could, and they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. Now before they had cast the anchors hoping that the anchors would slow them down. Now they just cut the anchors loose completely, trying to drive themselves toward this bay. Maybe they're thinking we can run aground here and we can somehow be saved. Maybe we won't run aground onto rocks. We'll see if maybe we can get to the beach. And so that's what they do. And of course, they're shipwrecked here. I want you to read with me as we continue in verse 41. It says, but striking a reef where two seas meet, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast, and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. I want you to notice something here that's important. First of all, notice the soldiers' plan in verse 42. They want to kill everybody. Now, the idea is that they kill the prisoners because it was their only sure way of making sure that nobody escaped. And if anybody did escape, that would be a capital offense for the soldiers. They would have to forfeit their own lives for the lives of those men who had escaped. So you could see that they had a vested interest in making sure that nobody got away. And the only thing they can think of is to kill everybody. So this is their thinking. We're gonna kill all the prisoners so that no one will swim away and escape. But notice what the centurion said in verse 43. He wanted to bring Paul safely through, and he kept the soldiers from their intention. Now, before we've seen this friendliness between Paul and Julius, the Roman commander. And we also see now how Julius's estimation of Paul is rising more and more and more. In fact, so much so that he wants to keep Paul safe. Notice how it singles out Paul. He wants to keep Paul safe. And because of that, all the rest of the prisoners are spared as well. Notice something. Have you noticed, again, Luke's incredible attention to detail? There's a lot of nautical language that Luke uses here. There's a lot of detail in very small things that Luke adds for us. And it tells us again just how careful Luke was in reporting truth in every aspect. If this wasn't truthful, we wouldn't have such attention to detail. We would have much more sweeping generalizations. But Luke is very careful to record these things for us in ways that could be checked out. Other soldiers, other sailors could look at the details that Luke, who himself was not a sailor, he was a doctor. But they could look at the details that Luke had included and say, yep, that's right. That's probably what men would have done. And everything he refers to in that technical nautical language is exactly true. And it just is another reason for us to consider the reliability and integrity of the Word of God. Well, let's get back to this shipwreck that's going on here. We've seen them now be driven by the waves to a place that they don't know where it is. We find out soon enough that this is actually going to be an island called Malta. Your version of your Bible may say Melita, but they find themselves stranded on this place. They finally get to it. Verses 43 and 44 tell us about how they jumped overboard, they grabbed hold of anything that they could, and they finally get to this place where maybe now hope will again begin to dawn for them. Let's read in chapter 28, beginning in verse 1. Acts 28, beginning in verse 1 says, "When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta, or Melita, as your version might say. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, 'Undoubtedly this man is a murderer, And though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island, named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed, afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to see him. And after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had these diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect. And when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. We see, as we continue in this narrative of Paul's time at Melita or Malta, that his interaction with the natives, at least at first, was somewhat dubious, or at least on their part. We see that there was, in spite of the fact that they showed him extraordinary kindness, they began to form an opinion of him, especially when Paul was bitten by a snake. They said, undoubtedly, this man is a murderer. In other words, they considered that if something bad were happening to Paul, it was divine justice. Now, they weren't talking about any kind of justice from the God of heaven. They were speaking of justice as its own deity, as though there was some metaphysical power out there that because of Paul's sin or just plain badness as a criminal, it was catching up to him. And they fully expected him to die at any moment. And that tells us something about what they knew considering this serpent, this viper that had bitten him. They recognized it as something that was not just a snake, but a poisonous snake. And they fully expected Paul to die. And they expected him to die because they figured, well, this is what happens to bad people. The gods are dealing with him. Justice is finally coming home to roost on his head. And you'll recognize that this is the same kind of thinking that we find throughout the Bible by men who have a skewed idea of what happens when bad things come to good people. This is the idea when we go many, many years back, considering Job's anguish and the things that had come upon him in the book that bears his name. Job's so-called friends come to him, and they consider that it must be because he had sinned somehow. Eliphaz, his so-called friend, said, "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, by the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they come to an end." And this was also the same kind of thinking of Job's other friends, Bildad and Zophar. They come to the same kind of idea. And we see that idea persisted throughout the ages, that if something bad happened, it must be because somehow you sinned. And in fact, even the Lord's disciples believed in this. In John chapter 9 and verse 2, they asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" And of course, Jesus says, well, it's not that anybody sinned, but this is an opportunity now to show the power of God. Well, they saw what had happened, going back to our narrative in Acts 28. They saw how Paul had just simply shaken the creature off into the fire, verse 5 tells us, and he suffered no harm. And they were expecting that at any minute he's just going to puff up and die, because that's what happens when you get bit by a poisonous snake. Verse 6 says, "But after they waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god." And remember, this is the very same kind of thing that had occurred with Paul and his companion back in Lystra in Acts chapter 14. They had considered that Paul was one of the gods who would come down, and the priest of the pagan gods in that city had brought out sacrifices and garlands and was wanting to offer things to them. And what Paul did was say, no, 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 we're not gods. We're just like you. Stop worshiping us. You need to worship the God of heaven. So Paul pointed back in Acts 14 to the God of heaven. I wonder if he did that here. We're told that Paul is introduced to a fellow named Publius, who, although Luke doesn't call him the procurator or governor, Publius is a common Roman name. But he does describe him as the leading man, not a leading man, but the leading man. And this leading man's father was very sick. And I find it interesting that, first of all, we see this hospitality among the natives. We saw that in verse 2. And now we see the same hospitality being shown by the island's leading man, this fellow who obviously commands the respect of his fellow islanders. And he treats Paul well in spite of the fact that his father is very sick. And Paul, being the kind man that he is, and the man who relies on God's power that he was, healed Publius's father. And after that, how much more do you think Paul rose in the estimation of the islanders? Verse 9 tells us that after this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. Paul did what he could. And he did what he could by the power of God. And he did what he could by the power of God to help other people. And it caused the people to see the goodness of the character and the integrity of Paul, and no doubt Luke and Aristarchus as well. But it prepared the people to help them when finally it was time to leave. In verse 10, it says, they also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. So when it was finally time for Paul to leave, we'll find later on that it was at the end of 3 months. That's what verse 11 says. By this time, they had gotten to know Paul somewhat. And although Luke doesn't mention any deeper spiritual significance of these incidents, we've seen the hand of God all through this. We've seen Paul as a prophet in Acts chapter 27 when he foretold what would happen, not only concerning the loss of the ship, but the saving of the lives of the passengers. We see Paul as a miraculous healer here on the island of Malta in chapter 28. But we wonder, did Paul preach the gospel at Malta? Luke doesn't say that he did. But knowing what we do about him, knowing that Paul would spend 3 months among people who don't know the Lord, and knowing how utterly committed Paul was to spreading the message of the gospel, it would seem that 3 months on a pagan island would have been too good an evangelistic opportunity for Paul to pass up. I believe that he didn't. I believe, and although it doesn't tell us that there were any converts on the island of Malta, I believe that at the very least, those natives heard the gospel and had been brought to a decision about Jesus themselves. Now, what they did concerning that decision, Luke doesn't tell us. But soon, Paul will be back on another ship on his way to Rome, the fulfillment of his desire, and the Lord's commission. We're so glad that you joined us in this study of the book of Acts. And next time, finally, we'll read where Paul makes it to Rome. Thanks for joining us. God bless you.